the Sharia-based society, the political, executive, whatever we want to call it, the empire or the emperor or the sultan, they had an authority that was above them. Even if they lived in tension with that authority, they had to adhere to the Sharia. The Sharia was a sovereignty that was above all other sovereignties. And so it acted as a check and a balance to the power of any sort of government or any sort of political arrangement. Whereas in the contemporary time that we live in, the state is the ultimate authority. They are judge, jury, and executioner, as we say. They can decide when the law applies and when the law doesn't apply, when we have our rights and when we don't have our rights.
Exactly. It's not just a theoretical matter. In France, for example, where the sovereign secular state is the ultimate god in a secularized sense, is actually dangerous, subversive to actually think, well, there may actually be authority, a theocentric understanding of society, that God actually is the ultimate authority. And this is actually a dangerous, problematized, even criminalized attitude to have if expressed publicly. So the state is not kind of neutral and comfortable with different ideas. Well, within a narrow confines. But if you step beyond that and question the fundamentals of the state, then you can even be expelled from the country, as we've seen certain imams. And this traditionally was a Catholic point as well. It's not just Muslims. Historically, Catholics also push back against this, but they've been quite domesticated in France now, unfortunately.
Right. And that's the work of the state is doing upon religion. And that's kind of what we were getting at when we talked about Talal Asad and formations of the secular, about how the state and specifically the secular modern nation state produces a form of acceptable religion and religiosity that is amenable to the personality of the state. That's one thing that Halak sort of uses as a phrase to get at. Because some people will point, well, what about, evangelical Christians in the United States, or what about the Anglican Church in the UK? Here's religion, and, so we don't really have secularism. It's like, no, the secular state gets to decide which forms of religiosity are amenable to it, give justification for it, actually assist in its project. And anything that violates the personality of the state, then that's going to be sidelined and, restricted, as, France is probably a very paradigmatic, and, essential exemplar of.
And I can't. Sorry, Tom. I can't resist to quote Halak on the very point that you actually paraphrased him. Halak wrote, "Let us remember." This is my favorite quote, but I always come up with this quote. Let us remember what secularism is. Secularism is not just segregating religious life into the private sphere. It is rather the determination of the state of what religion is and is not. This is just the point you were making, where and how it can be exercised. In terms of political theology, secularism is the murder of God by the state. Now, this is where Halak does rise to the poetic levels of Edward Said, I would argue, but only on this rare occasion.
Right. He has it in him. He has it in him.
He has it in him sometimes. The state, he continues, can delimit, limit, exclude, or curtail any religious practice. Think of France, hijab, etc. And thus has the power to determine the quality and quantity of the religious sphere as it, the state, sees fit. This is modern secularism. It's not neutral. This is me speaking, obviously. It's not neutral. It is, as Halak, I think, describes it eloquently for once, says here. Anyway, thank you.
And another way to he comes at it from another sort of way to think about it, if that's too, I think is very clear, but some people, maybe it's a little convoluted or confusing. He says the state exists for its own self. The state exists for its own sake, right? Even the citizens must sacrifice for the state, right? We have conscription and, war and all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Rather than the political bureaucracy or political arrangement being the means to an end. Okay. And that's really the difference here. If you look at Islamic history or Muslim history, whatever you want to call it, the history of the Ummah, the statecraft, we wouldn't call it that. Halak would object to that terminology. Whatever sort of political arrangement that existed was considered a means to an end.
Yes.
Right. A means to applying the Sharia, a means to, safeguarding rights, a means to doing all these other things. Whereas the state exists for its own self and its own sake, and it will do whatever it has to do to preserve its own sake.